Ready? Time to uncover the truth. Marlene Dietrich and Edith Piaf. In the winter of 1945, two of the most photographed women in the world were sharing a hotel room in Paris that neither of them ever officially mentioned again. The city had just been liberated, the champagne was real. And somewhere between the performance and the silence that followed it, Marlene Dietrich and Edith Piaf began something that their era had no approved language for, and that both of them were far too skilled to ever say out loud. The world they moved through ran on performance. Old Hollywood and the Parisian cabaret circuit were not industries that rewarded private truth. They rewarded the management of public image, and both women were masters of it. Dietrich had spent 2 decades constructing herself as the ultimate object of desire, cool, distant, and untouchable. Piaf had built her entire identity around suffering for love, specifically love of men, specifically love that destroyed her. Neither image left room for what was actually happening. According to Maria Riva's 1992 biography of her mother, passages in Dietrich's private letters described their relationship with Piaf in terms Riva characterized as far exceeding friendship. David Brett's Piaf, A Passionate Life, published in 1998, drew on contemporaries' accounts to document the same connection. Both women were publicly involved with men throughout this period, Piaf with boxer Marcel Cerdan, Dietrich with actor Jean Gabin. The approved romances were documented in every magazine in Europe. The real one was kept in letters. What makes this particular concealment extraordinary is how it worked. Dietrich's daughter described her mother as a woman who operated in sealed rooms, keeping separate lives in separate compartments with the discipline of a general. Piaf's concealment was different, built into her public persona of passionate, ruinous heterosexual love. The performance of one thing was the perfect cover for the other. They hid in plain sight by being exactly who the world expected them to be, everywhere the world was looking. Neither woman commented publicly on the other's death, no statement, no tribute, no acknowledgement beyond what professional courtesy required. If you were looking for the evidence in the official record, you would find almost nothing. And that near-total absence, in 2 careers otherwise documented to the last photograph, is itself the most revealing thing they ever left behind: Clark Gable and the studio's machinery. In 1933, MGM's legal apparatus quietly moved to contain a story that Louis B. Mayer had decided would never reach print. The most bankable male star in Hollywood was under a morality clause that could terminate his contract for conduct the studio considered professionally inconvenient. According to biographers Warren G. Harris and Jane Ellen Wayne, the conduct in question involved men, and the machinery built to suppress that fact was more elaborate than any set MGM ever constructed. The studio system of the 1930s and 40s operated on a simple principle. The star's image was a corporate asset, and corporate assets were protected. Morality clauses were not moral instruments, they were legal ones. A studio could void a contract, cancel a career, and blacklist an actor across the entire industry for behavior that threatened the investment. Homosexuality, or any suggestion of it, was considered the most dangerous threat of all. MGM did not manage this with discretion, it managed it with architecture. William Haynes was the clearest example of how the machinery worked. He was an MGM star, openly gay within the industry, who refused to enter a studio-arranged marriage when Mayer demanded it in 1933. His contract was terminated immediately. He never made another major film. Haynes spent the rest of his life with his partner Jimmy Shields, who survived him by only a few months after Haynes died in 1973. Gable's connection to Haynes, documented by multiple biographers, was one of the relationships the studio moved to quarantine. The more visible consequence came in 1939, when director George Cukor was removed from Gone with the Wind under circumstances MGM never satisfactorily explained. Cukor was Gable's director, Cukor was gay, and Cukor knew things. Film historians have connected those 3 facts for decades. Gable married 5 times. Each marriage was documented extensively, photographed enthusiastically, and reported as evidence of his essential masculinity. His studio files were sealed, his legal arrangements were private, he died in 1960, and the relevant documents remained inaccessible for years afterward. The official story held. It held because enough people with enough power needed it to hold, and because the alternative would have required admitting that the most powerful studio in Hollywood had spent 20 years manufacturing a man who didn't quite exist. The most powerful studio in Hollywood didn't just make films, it made identities. And some of those identities required other identities to be permanently erased, Cary Grant and Randolph Scott. In 1933, Photoplay magazine ran a spread that its editors framed as charming evidence of Hollywood bachelorhood. 2 of the studio system's most elegantly attractive men, Cary Grant and Randolph Scott, photographed in their shared Santa Monica home, cooking together, sunbathing together, moving through a shared domestic life with the ease of people who had been doing it for years. The magazine called it a bachelor paradise. Film historians now read it as something else entirely. Grant and Scott shared living arrangements intermittently across nearly a decade, from roughly 1932 to 1942, maintaining properties together in Santa Monica and later in the Los Feliz neighborhood of Los Angeles. This was not a brief or casual arrangement. It was a sustained, documented domestic life that overlapped entirely with both men's public romantic careers. Grant was simultaneously dating actresses and would eventually marry 5 times. Scott married twice. The approved relationships were always visible. The shared address was always explained as economic pragmatism or convenient friendship. What makes the Grant and Scott case unusual in the history of Hollywood concealment is the volume of surviving evidence. The photoplay photographs still exist. The shared lease records still exist. Contemporaries' accounts were collected by biographers Cary Brewer and others who interviewed people from the era while they were still alive. Grant himself, in a 1980 interview, gave an answer about Scott that biographers have characterized as precisely and deliberately incomplete. The kind of answer a man gives when he has spent 50 years practicing how not to answer. Grant's 4th wife, Diane Cannon, cited emotional behavior in their divorce proceedings that his biographers connected to unresolved questions about identity. Grant later acknowledged using LSD therapy in part to process those questions, a remarkable admission for a man of his generation and public stature. Scott died in 1987. Grant died in 1986. Neither man ever made a direct public statement about what their decade of shared life actually meant. The photoplay spread, which should have been the most obvious piece of evidence in the archive, was read for 40 years as a joke, a quaint relic of a more innocent Hollywood. It took generations of film scholars to look at those photographs and ask the obvious question. When the evidence is sitting in a 1933 magazine spread and it still took 80 years for anyone to say it plainly, what else are we not saying plainly right now? Greta Garbo and Mercedes de Acosta. In 1960, a Cuban-American playwright named Mercedes de Acosta published a memoir called Here Lies the Heart. It was not a subtle book. It described, in terms that left very little room for interpretation, a relationship with the most famous recluse in Hollywood history. Greta Garbo's response was immediate and permanent. She ended the friendship publicly, lobbied against the book's distribution, and never spoke to de Acosta again. For a woman whose defining characteristic was silence, it was the loudest thing she ever did. Garbo had spent her entire career making unknowability into a brand. She retired from film in 1941 at the age of 36 and spent the following 5 decades refusing almost everything: interviews, photographs, public appearances, and explanations. The persona of the unreachable woman was so complete that it became indistinguishable from the person. De Acosta made the fatal mistake of being knowable, of writing things down, of insisting that the relationship had been real enough to deserve a chapter. Garbo responded by treating that insistence as a betrayal. De Acosta died in 1968. Before she died, she took one final and carefully considered action. She deposited a sealed collection of correspondence at the Rosenbach Museum in Philadelphia with instructions that it remain closed for 10 years. When researchers opened the collection in 1978, they found letters from Garbo. Biographer Karen Swenson, working on her 1997 biography Greta Garbo: A Life Apart, used those letters and accounts from contemporaries to document the relationship in full. The letters confirmed what de Acosta had written 18 years earlier. They confirmed what Garbo had spent the intervening decades refusing to confirm. Garbo lived until 1990. She outlived de Acosta by 22 years, and she spent every one of those years maintaining the same silence she had always maintained. The sealed box is the detail that changes everything in retrospect. De Acosta knew that the truth needed a timed release, that the world required a decade of distance before it could hold what she had to say. She was right. The world wasn't ready in 1960 for... It was barely ready in 1978. She asked the world to wait 10 years before reading the truth. The world had already been waiting 30. Rock Hudson and the White House photograph. On July 25, 1985, Rock Hudson became the first major celebrity to publicly announce an AIDS diagnosis. He did not choose to make this announcement. A French hospital released the information before his team could manage it, and the suppression apparatus that had protected him for 30 years collapsed in a single afternoon. He died 69 days later, on October 2, 1985. He was 59 years old. Hudson had been under contract to Universal Studios since the early 1950s. His homosexuality was known within the industry and managed by his publicist Henry Wilson, who arranged a brief marriage to Phyllis Gates in 1955. The marriage lasted 3 years and served its purpose. It generated photographs, headlines, and the public perception of a heterosexual leading man. Wilson was known in Hollywood circles for trading in exactly this kind of information, using knowledge of clients' private lives as currency within the studio system. Hudson's image was maintained through a combination of legal arrangements, managed publicity, and the industry-wide silence that protected careers and investments simultaneously. Biographer Mark Griffin, in his comprehensive account of Hudson's life, documented the full scope of that concealment across decades. What Griffin's research also revealed was the relationship Hudson maintained with Mark Christian from approximately 1983 to 1985, during which time Hudson did not disclose his HIV status to Christian. Christian sued Hudson's estate after Hudson's death. A jury awarded him $21,750,000 in 1989, later reduced to $5,500,000 on appeal. The case made the concealment a matter of public legal record. In May of 1984, 1 year before his diagnosis became public, Hudson attended a state dinner at the White House. Photographs from that evening show him standing beside Ronald and Nancy Reagan, visibly unwell to eyes that knew what to look for. The Reagans, who had known Hudson for decades through Hollywood circles, did not publicly address AIDS policy in any meaningful way until after Hudson's death made silence politically impossible. The photograph exists. The timeline exists. The policy silence exists. If the most recognizable face in Hollywood couldn't be seen for what he was, what were we actually looking at all those years? Katharine Hepburn and the story nobody filmed. In the spring of 1942, Katharine Hepburn began working with Spencer Tracy on a film called Woman of the Year. By most accounts, something real developed between them. They made 9 films together across 25 years. Tracy never divorced his wife Louise, citing his Catholicism. The relationship existed in public as Hollywood's great unconsummated romance, visible enough to generate decades of coverage, ambiguous enough to remain technically deniable. It was, by any measure, an extraordinarily well-managed public narrative. The question biographer William J. Mann spent years asking was what it was managing. Mann's 2006 biography. Kate, the woman who was Hepburn, drew on interviews with contemporaries and extensive correspondence to argue that Hepburn's primary emotional and romantic life ran on a different track from the one that appeared in the press. The most significant early relationship Mann documented was with Laura Harding, a socialite and American Express heiress whose connection to Hepburn in the 1930s is corroborated by multiple contemporaries' accounts. The Tracy relationship, Mann argued, was real in its affection but functioned simultaneously as a kind of public anchor, a visible, safe, and sympathetic story that explained Hepburn's life without requiring her to explain it herself. What the public narrative never included was Phyllis Wilborn. Wilborn became Hepburn's personal secretary and constant companion in 1955. She was present at Hepburn's home in Connecticut, at her New York apartment, and at her side through the full arc of the Tracy years and the 3 decades that followed his death in 1967. Hepburn's 1991 autobiography, Me and Stories of My Life, is notably careful around the subject of Tracy's wife and entirely silent about Wilborn's relational role. Wilborn was present when Hepburn died in June of 2003. She died herself in August of 2004, approximately 14 months later. Hepburn's memoir names what she chose to name and leaves the rest in silence, which was always how she operated. The Tracy romance is the story Hollywood told because it was the story that fit every available category. The one nobody filmed was quieter, longer, and present in the room when the famous one ended. The love story everyone knows lasted 25 years and made 9 films. The one nobody filmed lasted 48 years and never took a day off. Marlon Brando and the Ashes He Kept. In 1976, Marlon Brando gave an interview to the French magazine Paris Match. Among the things he said was this: "Homosexuality is so much in fashion, it no longer makes news. Like a large number of men, I too have had homosexual experiences, and I am not ashamed. It was one of the earliest public admissions of bisexuality by a major Hollywood star. American media largely did not report it. The world filed it under eccentricity and moved on. The real story wasn't the admission, the real story was Wally Cox. Cox and Brando had met as children, growing up near each other in the Midwest, and the friendship they formed lasted the rest of Cox's life. By the time both men were adults in New York, the connection between them was observed by everyone in their circle." Peter Manso's 1994 biography, Brando drew on extensive interviews to document the relationship, noting that Brando spoke about Cox in emotional registers he never used when discussing his 3 wives or his many documented romantic relationships with women. Cox became a television actor known for the 1950s series Mr. Peepers, while Brando became the defining film actor of his generation. The distance in their public profiles never seemed to affect the private one. Cox died in February of 1973. He was 48 years old. Brando was at his side. After Cox's death, Brando kept his ashes. Not temporarily, not as a transitional gesture. He kept them for 31 years, through the filming of The Godfather's aftermath, through his later career, through his legal battles and public controversies, and everything else that constituted the last 3 decades of his life. When Brando died on July 1st, 2004, his instructions were that Cox's ashes be interred alongside his own. Some researchers have also documented, through correspondence, a connection between Brando and James Baldwin during the civil rights era, though that relationship is less fully confirmed in primary sources. He told a French journalist the truth in 1976 and nobody listened. He told the world the truth in 2004 and all he needed was an urn, James Dean and the letters they locked away. James Dean died on September 30th, 1955, on Highway 46 near Cholem, California. He was 24 years old. He had completed 3 films. He was the most photographed young man in America, and his image was already, even before the crash, being carefully managed by the people who understood what it was worth. After the crash, that management became the primary business of his estate. And some of what got managed was correspondence. Dean had arrived in New York in the early 1950s with almost nothing. The person who helped change that was Rogers Brackett, a radio director who encountered Dean around 1951 and became instrumental in his early career, helping him find work, make connections, and navigate an industry that operated on access and relationships. Multiple biographers, including Val Hawley and Donald Spoto, documented this relationship drawing on contemporaries' accounts. Assentis. It was not the only significant relationship of its kind in Dean's short life, and Dennis Stock, the photographer who traveled with Dean through a cross-country journey in 1955, produced images from that trip that remain among the most studied photographs in Hollywood history, pictures that show something about intimacy and ease that the captions never quite captured. Dean's letters were controlled by his estate after his death. Portions were published in selective form in Venable Herndon's 1974 account of Dean's life. What was selected and what was withheld became, over time, a subject of scholarly discussion in itself. Director Elia Kazan, who directed Dean in East of Eden in 1955 and wrote about him in his autobiography with evident admiration, was conspicuously imprecise about the boundaries of their professional relationship. The estate's legal interventions in response to certain biographical claims, sustained across decades and significant in their cost, became in time a kind of evidence of their own. Institutions do not spend decades and substantial resources protecting a dead man's image from a story unless the story is true enough to matter. He was 24 years old and already the most photographed young man in America. The photographs you've seen are the ones they chose. The ones they didn't choose are the ones that explain everything. Josephine Baker and the Secret Inside the Sequins. In 1940, Josephine Baker was simultaneously the most famous black woman on the planet, an agent of French military intelligence, and conducting a relationship that none of the American newspapers covering her career ever mentioned. The French 12e Bureau had recruited her approximately a year earlier, recognizing that her celebrity gave her access to embassy parties, diplomatic gatherings, and conversations that conventional operatives could never reach. She used that access, and she used it with a sophistication that intelligence historians have documented with increasing specificity in recent decades. The method she used to transmit intelligence has been confirmed by multiple sources, including accounts Baker gave later in her life and research by historians of the French Resistance. She wrote information in invisible ink on her sheet music. The notes traveled where Josephine Baker traveled, which was everywhere because she was Josephine Baker, and no one thought to look at the music. Gilles Perrault and other historians of the Resistance period have documented the network she was part of and the specific risks she took in crossing borders during a period when getting those crossings wrong meant something irreversible. She was awarded the Croix de Guerre, the Rosette de la Résistance, and was made a Chevalier of the Légion d'honneur by Charles de Gaulle after the war. What the official record of her wartime heroism consistently omitted was the personal architecture running alongside it. Baker married 4 times. Biographer Phyllis Rose, in her 1989 account Jazz Cleopatra, documented the relationships that existed outside those marriages, including her connection with French cabaret singer Maurice Damia, a relationship corroborated by contemporaries' accounts and addressed in subsequent biographical scholarship. Baker died on April 12, 1975, 4 days after the opening night of a Paris comeback show she had spent years preparing. The timing was almost theatrical. She had spent her entire life hiding the most important things inside the most spectacular performances. She danced for kings and spied for France and loved who she chose, and none of it appeared in the same paragraph. How many other stories are we still reading in the wrong order? Marlene Dietrich and the letters in Mexico City. When Marlene Dietrich died in Paris on May 6, 1992, she had been in voluntary isolation for 12 years. Since 1979, she had remained inside her apartment at 12 Avenue Montaigne, refusing photographs, refusing interviews, refusing almost every visitor. In 1984, director Maximilian Schell persuaded her to participate in a documentary about her life. She agreed on one condition: she would not be filmed. The documentary, titled Marlene, won the Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature. The most famous face in the history of cinema appeared in it only as a voice. Even at the end, she controlled exactly what you were allowed to see. Dietrich had spent 60 years making control look effortless. Her daughter Maria Riva's 1992 biography documented what that control was protecting, including Dietrich's relationships with women throughout her life and career. Among those documented by Riva was actress Claudette Colbert, a connection corroborated by contemporaries. The relationship that Riva addressed with the most biographical weight, however, was the one with Dolores Del Rio, the Mexican actress whose career ran parallel to Dietrich's across decades of the studio era. Del Rio, born in 1904 and died in 1983, was one of the most significant figures in both Mexican and Hollywood cinema. Biographer Joanne Hirschfield's work on Del Rio's career and life addresses the relationship with Dietrich in terms drawn from contemporaries and available correspondence. Portions of the correspondence between Dietrich and Del Rio have never been published in English. Some of that correspondence is held in archives in Mexico City. Del Rio died 9 years before Dietrich in 1983, and Dietrich spent the 9 years that followed in the same apartment, in the same silence, declining to explain anything to anyone. The woman who once said that she was not mysterious, she was just absent, had made her absence so complete that even now, the fullest account of her private life requires reading documents in another language in another country that most people do not know exist. She spent 12 years becoming invisible. She spent 60 years before that, making sure you were always looking in the wrong direction. The letters are in Mexico City. Nobody has published them, and Marlene Dietrich, even now, is still keeping her secret. 10 names, 10 careers, 10 carefully constructed public identities built to withstand scrutiny and designed to make scrutiny feel unnecessary. What connects all of them is not the secret itself, but the infrastructure of the secret, the studios that built legal walls around their stars, the publicists who arranged marriages as corporate strategy, the journalists who knew and chose not to print, and the audiences who were given a story and accepted it because the story was good enough. History records the approved version first. It always does. The biographers come later. The sealed letters open on a 10-year delay. The ashes speak when everything else has gone quiet. What these 10 people understood, each in their own way, is that the most durable form of concealment is not hiding. It is performing something so convincing in the right direction that no one thinks to look in the other. The question worth sitting with is not how they kept these secrets. It is what it cost them, every single day, to keep performing the version the world had decided to believe. Subscribe if you want to keep asking the questions that the official record forgot to answer. And go to the comments and tell us which of these 10 stories you think history worked hardest to erase.